it is within the discretion of typically law enforcement, certainly a court, to take various circumstances into account when administering a sentence. But Seattle's got a very different idea, do they not?
That's right, Jeff. And you could not have queued up this story better. It has always been true that a court, a prosecutor, a police officer has the discretion to decide, well, am I going to treat a thief from Nordstrom's the same as a woman that steals a bottle of baby formula to feed her starving child? Am I going to look at the theft of a fur coat from a high-end store the same as the theft of a blanket by a homeless person who's freezing on the streets of New York City? So you can always look at circumstances to decide whether to pursue certain types of crime. We call that discretion, as you said. Very different from what they're thinking about in Seattle. They're basically talking about, I don't really want to say decriminalizing, because it appears that it would be more of a defense to some of these lower level misdemeanor, especially theft crimes, to say that you needed to do it to survive. So survival crimes is something that's been recognized for a long time, but nobody's ever really codified the reality that you can use it as a defense. Do we want to do that, Jeff? Because, I mean, there's a difference between, let's say, stealing a sandwich from 7-Eleven because you honestly are starving to death versus me breaking into your home and raiding your refrigerator for the same reasons. So there would need to be, in the law we hate slippery slopes, there would need to be an enormous amount of clarification surrounding a law like this, even if it's just at a city council level.
And again, you mentioned the example of stealing food. All right. Do you have to show that the individual is seriously in need, as opposed to someone who perhaps is a little more robust in size? And you'd say, well, you didn't need to steal that. This person looks hungrier. I mean, you really get into some thorny issues with this.
Yep, that's exactly right. What a practical example, because survival crimes are required to survive. And you would be hard pressed to succeed with a defense like that if you were more robust, as you point out. You could think of other examples as well. By the way, this exception, this proposed exception hasn't even been written. It wouldn't apply to crimes like domestic violence, driving under the influence. So there's lots of things that wouldn't come under this. And you wonder what would if we really take this to its extreme and basically say, look, you want survival crimes, you have to prove they needed to do it to survive. Whether it's breaking into somebody's home, breaking into a warehouse, stealing from 7-Eleven, or stealing from Walmart. There also needs to be a victim compensation fund available, because if you're going to excuse crime, not that these people could repay the money anyway, or they probably wouldn't be stealing, but you also need to find a way to compensate the victim. So you mentioned thorny issues, an understatement for sure. A great point.
Another issue that has come up certainly in the last 6 to 9 months during the pandemic is, all right, if you're going to close this business, but you're going to leave this one open, again, the ever popular slippery slope, how do you determine things? And there have always been some wonderful loopholes, and there's one right there in your backyard, thanks to the California governor and his rules. So fill us in, please.
That's right. So slippery slopes are unpopular, and you and I had talked about them with respect to almost every type of proposed legislation, because that's what we worry about. Here, very sort of a unique scenario is there were 2 strip clubs that were closed down like everybody else was. They brought suit, and a judge basically said, you are allowed to stay open, not because you have strippers or artists, as the ruling actually called them, but because you have restaurant service. So this was a ruling that was more broadly interpreted to businesses with restaurant service. Now, that broad ruling was basically put on hold just 2 days later by an appellate court. And you and I know that happens all the time. People seek review, it's appealed. And so it's currently, everything is still closed again. Now, whether or not people are actually complying with that closure, whole other story, Jeff, and I'm sure we'll continue to be talking about that even come January. But these kinds of rulings are really across the country. Sometimes they make sensational headlines, but they're fairly straightforward. Businesses that have restaurant services could be businesses that have adult entertainment, or they could be a family coffee shop down the block. But whatever it is, that has to comply with the same rules. And one of the things that all these cases have in common is basically courts are saying, show me the nexus. How are you going to show, given that there's no COVID cases that came out of your establishment, that closing you, small business, is going to increase hospital beds? So that's the kind of nexus that across the country judges are struggling to find.
We've talked previously about rules in New York City, New York State, where they said you had to serve food in order to be open. And it was a bar that was selling like a celery stick for $1. just to say they sold food. And we've had these rules in all manner of states. What percentage of food do you need to sell in order to have your bar open at different times? This is just a continuation of it, and it proves how difficult it is to set these rules, because once you draw a line, there's always somebody who's going to be seeing just how close they can get to it. And that's the difficulty of drafting legislation and certainly enforcement.
Both, both and Jeff, because drafting it's one thing, but it's not being enforced. And across the country, many agencies are saying it's not that we don't want to follow the law, but we are responding to robberies and burglaries and rapes and assaultive crimes, and we're getting drunk drivers off the street. We are not going to enforce who is or isn't social distancing or wearing masks, or even who is or isn't open during the pandemic. So I'll tell you, a lot of thorny issues, as you point out, no easy solutions just yet.
I don't have children, so I don't have to worry about this, but some people I've talked to have said, I like having the kids at home more, but it's one thing to be a parent supervising my kid. Now I'm the parent supervising my kid and their schoolwork, and that takes it to a whole nother level, and some things are falling through the cracks, probably not surprisingly.
Not surprisingly, particularly given the stress that both parents and kids are under. So, in some jurisdictions, they're basically fining parents if their kids don't turn in homework on time, if they're truant. What does truant mean if you're going to remote school? Well, some schools say it means if your camera's off. But then again, parents point out there are many reasons that children want to have cameras off. Some are just very socially anxious. And schools, by the way, I always like to give you both sides of the equation. Schools are really bending over backwards to try to accommodate parents and students alike that are struggling. I mean, not every parent has the luxury, first of all, of remote working to begin with. And if they do, remote work means working, not babysitting. Nobody's been in this position before. So schools are really trying to cut parents some slack. But it's also true that you don't need that letter in the mail threatening legal action. If you're a parent trying to struggle to make ends meet, you're anxious as it is, your child is suffering anxiety, also not turning in work on time, and now you get a letter saying basically, we're going to fine you, parent, for the actions of your children that you may not even have known about because you're remote working in the next room. So another issue that I'm glad that we're discussing, because school districts are really scrambling to try to figure out how can we make this fair to where nobody is unduly penalized for trying to do the best they can in difficult times, especially over the holiday season.
We have heard about grade points really dropping for a lot of young people because they either don't, they haven't gotten accustomed to the remote learning, or they just aren't turning in assignments like this. But you're right. The first resort should not be the truant officer with a certified letter to the door of the home.
No, that's not the Christmas gift that anybody wants to get. You get all your Christmas cards in the mail, and then there's that letter threatening to fine you or sue you or take you to court because of something you didn't even know that your child had done. So, yeah, no, let's wait till after the holidays to deal with this. And then let's deal with it in a fashion that incorporates the needs and the equities of the students and the parents.